So Jay, this is round two for you and I. We've got a lot of stuff going on in these next few weeks. I mean, we have the food drive that just launched yesterday, which is an important one. We can talk about that later. But I mentioned in the last video how you wear so many hats, and waste management, the environment, infrastructure services, all that kind of stuff. But you've been given a pretty hefty file around climate change. And that's an important one. And I know that the city has developed a climate emergency action plan. I presume many cities are doing that across the country. How did that come together? How did you put that together?
Well, I'll tell you, it was something that was, I guess, started probably with a declaration of a climate emergency back in 2019. And that community brought that forward to committee and council. Council said, yes, we agree. And many communities in North America and around the world were declaring that. So
Yeah.
it was really a statement. But let's be honest, you make a statement like that, you've got to follow that up with a plan.
Yeah.
And the pandemic hits, and so wow, okay, well, we're dealing with a crisis, but there's other issues out there. So we had to prepare that plan. We did that during the pandemic, and therefore we did pretty much everything online, everything by email, and over about a year and a half to almost 2 year period of engagement and research and chatting with colleagues in other municipalities, chatting with the provincial government. Hearing from Londoners and all that, we were able to pull together a plan that council was very satisfied with. And that occurred through a two-part meeting, one where the plan was tabled for final look for the public. And then on April of 2022, council said, yes, this is the direction we need to head. And as staff, we're very pleased because basically we were channeling the information that we had received from the community and also taking a very realistic approach of what needs to be done over about almost a 30-year period, because council had already said by 2050, it wished to be basically net greenhouse gas emissions locally in London. And that's a huge and lofty goal, but you have to put together a plan and milestone targets along the way. And so that was all part of that. So we were very pleased to have it approved. So that goes back essentially a year ago now. So, yeah. And over the course of the last year, I'll tell you, it's been exciting. We'll talk more about that. But, Glenn, you understand, though, it's one to say there's a plan, but you've got to live and breathe the plan. And that takes additional time and effort. And so that's rewarding that we've come in 1 year and we were able to measure progress. And we'll chat about that. But just getting the plan out of the gate and getting council all on board. And now the new council, that's how it works through local government. You need lots of participation.
Yeah. And I know food is part of all of that, and we got into that a bit last time, and we will a bit this time as well. But I presume you were prescribed a budget to go along with that, and then there was a series of goals. How do you measure if you're achieving those goals or not? I know that you've just put out a status report, I think a progress report. How do you measure that? How's that put together?
Well, that's the thing. It's so important. Like, how do you know you're moving along in the plan? And so we looked at it from about 5 key areas. And let me just spend a little bit of time for your viewers on this. So there's the plan itself, and that plan has 200 actions over the course of about the next 4 years. So they're all listed there. Then, of course, what are residents and businesses and institutions and community groups doing? We've got to find a way to sort of measure that. So that's another one of those outcome areas. Then we have to say to ourselves, look, this is highly influenced by what occurs at the provincial government here in Ontario, what occurs at the federal government level. And let's face it, around the world, things happen that are either, most often out of our control, but influence what happens from a climate change perspective here in London. So we've got to pay attention to that. We can measure greenhouse gases locally. So that is a big outcome area, and we'll talk about that. And then the other one, this is a really interesting one, weather and severe weather. Well, it's influencing and impacting London now, not to the scale of what we're seeing in some other areas of Canada, last year and this year, and some of the devastation that's occurring kind of as we speak, right? That is associated with the changing climate and severe weather. So we're reporting on that as well. And one reason we're doing that, Glenn, let's just face it, every time you and Jane and others get together, what's one of the things we always talk about? We talk about the weather.
Yeah.
So the weather gives us an opportunity to dialogue on climate change. And it's one of those common denominators. We all think about the weather because we want to always have great weather. But when that severe weather comes in and we get into situations and catastrophes, we have to be resilient and be able to get bounced back quickly and take care of one another. So that's another one of the outcome areas that we are measuring progress on as part of the Climate Emergency Action Plan. Those are big, big areas, but over time, we'll have a track record of information. And after 1 year, yeah, we've got data to show that we're moving in the right direction in all areas but one. And we'll talk about that, but we'll have to unpack that as we go along here. That's in our conversation.
So can I just ask you, I do want to talk about how we did in this past year, but do you do it in sizable chunks? So you say it goes to 2050, right? So do you do that in 5-year increments? Like, I presume it has to be something that's manageable as opposed to something that's 30 years long.
Yeah.
How do you break that?
We've set up what we call kind of community milestone targets, and our first one is 2030. Okay. So that is, 6 to 7 years from now.
Yeah.
So when we initially set it up, it was, 8 or 9 years. To us, that's a manageable and an understandable time frame. For council, in this case, city council, they're together for 4 years. So they work towards a strategic plan, and they have objectives that they have set within that 4-year period. But the 4 years on the road to 2030 is really, really key. But the reason for selecting 2030, it's referred to as science-based targets. We have to achieve certain targets collectively by 2030. And that's been assigned to all communities around the world, and they're called fair share. And this has been done by groups involved with like the IPCC, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, worldwide scientists getting together, prescribing what's needed for the world. Then we bring them into North America, we bring them to Canada and London. And fair share means, in London's case, we have to do a lot more than other parts of the world because we just consume more and we generate more greenhouse gas per person than other parts of the world. And although you'll hear that other countries are going in the wrong direction, well, perhaps though those countries aren't, we've already gone in the wrong direction. So we've got to get involved with corrective action sooner than some others. And that's why that notion of doing your fair share is key. And in London's case, yes, that's what the 2030 targets are all about, doing our fair share.
Yeah, so as you know, Jane and I do development programs in South Sudan, for instance. Climate change there is major. Like there's major famines going on right now. There's the rains are 3 weeks late. They also end early. So there's 8 million people living in that area, but collectively, they hardly put anything into this equation about climate change, right? They don't live in great, huge cities like we do. They don't drive cars. They don't do any of that kind of stuff. But I know that in meeting with United Nations officials and others, they are realizing that the impact of the rest of us, especially in the West and the more affluent nations, has had a direct impact on that group, those group of people in South Sudan who really had very little as far as input into the problem. And yet they're having to deal with some of the major stuff. They're right on the edge of survival with it.
Yeah, and to grasp all of that, you really got to spend time. And in our Climate Emergency Action Plan, we have different sections that introduce the reader to these different concepts. And what you described there is crucial because that fair share concept was just summarized so nicely there. People in Sudan are not contributing to the greenhouse gas impact the way we are. That's the reality. Therefore, they cannot be asked to do the same level of activity because they are already doing so little towards the problem that they're enduring. Yeah. That occurs around the world, and that's that notion of fair share. The wealthier countries must do more. I sound like I'm preaching here, Glenn, but that's the reality of how it works. And I know in London, there'll be some that actually disagree with that. But when they sit back and they sort of say, I have friends or cousins in other parts of the world, and you do see those news clips, those are real. And that understanding has to be brought into the bigger picture. That's why, as much as we don't have to solve this overnight, we have to first increase our understanding and realize that resources are for all, and we need to begin to share and better share and all that. And this has been going on for decades.
Yeah.
But now is the time for even deeper thinking.
So when I used to work in Ottawa, as you know, one of the first big project, or the first big project I worked on was climate change refugees or environmental refugees. And, you know, we look at things like the war in Ukraine and those things that are going on. But the reality is there are now more refugees migrating around the world than there were after World War II. This is the highest ever. And yet roughly 2/3 of those are climate change refugees. They're not leaving because of war and conflict, although those are often part of it as people struggle to gain resources. But a lot of it is, just like in Sudan, people can no longer grow crops, right? Other parts of Sudan, they might be flooded out. So I think it's really important, the stuff that you're saying. And governments have to get a hold of that. You know, they have to realize that part of the climate change problem, as far as all of these refugees, millions and millions of them, we ourselves contributed to that. And so now that's come home to roost. And we're going to have to find ways to deal with it. So, you know, you and I talked about this the last time. Back in 2007, I was part of a group of meetings with 100 other Canadians about the future. And then climate change was all the big stuff, the stuff that government has to do or General Motors has to do or those kind of things. But now looking at it 15 years later, really the action places, the actionable plans that are really dealing with it are the communities themselves, small and large. Right? So I presume part of the reason we will be successful as a community is if we realize our impacts are far larger than we realize. We might just want to judge it by London, and we will measure it by that. But there are these other greater effects that are also affecting the globe in different places. And the more we keep that into account, I presume the better we'll do at disciplining ourselves towards our goals.
Absolutely. But there, you know, that's some of the challenge too, right? Because we are asking Londoners, in our case, that's, you know, that's my goal, is to work with Londoners, but we're asking them to some very much understand this. It's not that the others don't understand it. There are other priorities in their daily lives, and they're not able to perhaps wrap their mind around the bigger picture. Or Glenn, let's face it here, let's be honest, some people just disagree too, right? So at the city here, we have to work. I wouldn't say it's balanced. We listen to everyone because that's the right way to do it, and then try to weave together plans that make sense. But it really begins with that dialogue and that discussion. And what I find often is that even when I'm with someone in the community and we disagree on how to move forward, we are still further ahead because we understand both sides.
Yeah.
And often it's not even a side, because it's just a different view on how things work.
Yeah.
But there's no denying really that there are things out there that are changing. And, you know, when we get into food drives and food campaigns, they're all tied together. These are all parts of the larger piece. And that's what I like so much about the London Cares Food Curb Hunger campaign, is it gives a chance for this kind of dialogue. And for me and the folks I work with, we get to tie in these other pieces as we're doing right now. That is so important, because people have got to understand the connections that are out there. And, you know, you've captured a few, and they're big picture things, but they hit home hard.
I do think, though, that you know, you're right that there's disagreement, but there's also a lot more agreement than I think that there was 10 years ago. It's not as much of a political football now. And I think what you're seeing is, especially as it's community related, what you're seeing is organizations, like I think of things like the United Nations Millennial Development Goals that were developed in the 90s for the year 2000, right? And that was for the world. And then they had the next follow-up to that, which are the Sustainable Development Goals. And I was part of developing a lot of that stuff for the United Nations, but the London Community Foundation's adopted those, the Food Bank has adopted those, the Chamber has adopted those, I think the city has as well. I mean, we see ourselves as part of a team, this larger global team. And although we can measure our own, and it's very important we do that, it's important too that we have measurements that are on a global scale to see how we're doing. I'm not trying to get you into that, but I do think that there's much more of an awareness about that communities play a part in that larger picture. And I think organizations within London are, I mean, part of the reason why they're concentrating so much on food and food security is because that's one of the key sustainable development goals that the United Nations has put out there, and Canada has signed on to that as well. You touched on the progress report for the Climate Emergency Action Plan. How did we do in 2022? Where did you see us succeeding, or where are areas that we need to work on?
Well, as I mentioned, there's these big sort of outcome areas. So when we've got a plan, it has 200 actions.
Yeah.
For those actions in 2022, and that's what we're measuring progress year by year. So in 2022, 90% of the actions that we said we would start were in fact started. And so that's working well. The community itself, when we look around at individuals, we look around at community groups, with businesses, institutions, we have clearly seen more activity in the last 8 months to 1 year, just as you've described. So that is very evident out there. So as much as it's difficult to measure, you grab some simple things. 2 years ago, when New Earth Fest came out on April 22nd here in London at Victoria Park, about 600 people attended.
Yeah.
This year for 2023, we had 2,000 people. And when I say we, many excellent community group members and volunteers were behind that. So those are small pieces that add up to big things. So that's moving in the right direction. Other levels of government, the provincial government, their investment in electric vehicles and battery plants, that's positive. Federal government, there's a lot of big pieces going on. So we're seeing a lot of action at both the provincial and federal government. You've highlighted stuff with the UN that's out there too, so that's all positive. Where we have the discouraging news, it's when you actually start measuring greenhouse gases. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Remember, over a 2-year period, we were in a pandemic and there was less activity occurring.
Yeah.
Less people were traveling around. So for 2 years, our greenhouse gases locally dropped. What happened in 2022 is they've gone up by 8%. So here's the thing that you've got to wrap your mind around, is that many elements are showing positive movement forward. Then you have to ask yourself, then why did our greenhouse gases go up? That's the challenge on that element, is that measuring those items, it's got to be done over a longer period of time. We have a city that's growing. 3% growth in this city is what's occurring right now. That's double the norm for London. We're one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. So that's good news for many reasons. On the downside, that means we are producing more greenhouse gases. So we've got to get that under control. And
one of the good things that we talked about last time was, and this came out largely as a result of the Curb Hunger food drive and working with the city and grocery stores and also the food bank. But this idea of diverting food that would normally go to the landfill, right? So there's things like that which produce huge amounts of methane gas. We know that that's all been studied and done. So I think you were saying last time that since 2017, 2.3 million pounds of food have been diverted from the landfill to come this way. So that's one of the areas. I know there's many more, but that's one of the areas where we can all participate in order to make a difference on that. So
we know why.
Yeah.
And it comes to our transportation, as we talked about, also heating and cooling our homes. So we have to understand what can we do in our sort of households, whether it's an apartment, whether it's a high-rise building, your home, single family, multifamily. Got to get a handle on how we basically reduce our reliance on fossil fuels there, primarily for heating and cooling. And then, as you mentioned, Glenn, food waste. Very interesting, because that is a local and global impact. As we talked about there, greenhouse gases worldwide, about a third of our greenhouse gases are associated with the food distribution system.
Globally. Yeah, that's right.
So then you look at locally, what can you do? And we'll always come back to that.
Mm.
The greenhouse gas, they're going to bounce around each year because it's very dependent on climate, on weather conditions. But we have to see movement on things such as the food waste, and asking ourselves, why do we have such an issue with food waste? And we've been studying that here in London for a number of years, and our stats are very compelling, I'll tell you, on what's going wrong and how it can be changed. And we believe it's actually a fix that is quite easy because it puts money back into your pocket.
Yeah. I would think, Jay, that as imposing a task as all this is, there are some, I think, really welcome signs out there. I think of all the different groups. You know, the food bank came along and we did a greenhouse, and it captured lots of attention because not much else was going on during COVID time. And so it gets lots of attention. But in reality, there were so many different community groups that have worked doing, you know, fruit trees, community gardens, you know, adopt a garden, plant a row, grow a row. They've been doing these things for years and years and years, and never quite got the attention I think that they probably deserved. That, you know, but they've done remarkable work. But in the last few years, I see things like the Patch in London that you talked about last time. I think of groups like Urban Roots and others who are doing some. They're all doing really significant things. And I think when you're talking about urban agriculture and how that plays into this larger picture, there are some key players that I think have really stepped up, the city being one of them. But when I think of some of these other groups and what they have done, they come from a really good place, and they're really wanting to bring all of us back to the land and do it in a way that's sustainable. I presume that for you, although you look at the big pictures all the time, you're kind of like a weatherman. You say, well, there's a big storm gathering over here or whatever it is, but you know, over here we have some good stuff. And I think it must be encouraging to you and your team to see a lot of these groups like Urban Roots and the others in Western Fair, as you have mentioned, really stepping up.
Oh, absolutely. And we heard some of those stories at the launch, right? So it's essential. Anytime I have a discouraging result to share, it's important to share that. It's more important, what do you do? And this is all occurring now. And in London, the actions that are required to reduce greenhouse gas locally are all occurring right here in London. Yeah. We have all those very successful examples from well-respected Londoners, volunteers who are spending time to show it's possible. And in some cases, just with a roll up your sleeves and a little bit of work, very easy to do. We now need to have that done on a much larger scale. So I look at all those folks out there doing work right now, whether you call them early adopters or whatever it might be, they are the true leaders in this community. At the city, you know, we want to see them succeed, and if we can help out, or that's one of our goals. Yeah. But just the satisfaction we get of seeing those activities occurring. I often say the best meeting that occurs is one that I'm not at, because people are talking about what can they do. Yeah. You can't rely on the city here, let's face it here, to get us out of this jam. We are one of the many players, and individually, I and my wife Barb, we've got to do our part, and every year do a little bit more and encourage our neighbors to do more. That's how we're going to win this battle.
Yeah. There are politics and other things involved, but I do know back in 2017, they figured that was the first time in human history that over half of the global population lived in cities, right? Yep. All different sizes of cities. So we've now been at this for 5 years, and that population in cities continues to grow. And yet in the political scheme of things, you look at Canada, for instance, federalism. You have the federal government, you have the provincial government, and you have cities down here. And the cities are the ones that, they're often the ones left with all of the problems of the lack of, because of the neglect sometimes of senior jurisdictions. But on this one, I think when it comes to climate change and food and other things, I think this is where communities can really pick up that and run with it and give direction to those senior levels, because they've got all of these different communities. They're doing things that don't just involve citizens, but businesses and schools, education systems, hospitals, food banks, all of those type of groups. They're all coming together and doing it. And I would have to think that when it comes to this subject, that cities actually have an advantage over the other jurisdictions. They don't have the big clout that the other ones do. But we've got these everyday stories that we are telling as communities about the difference that we can make. And we have the Curb Hunger food drive. We announced it yesterday, Jay. It's an important thing. It's been going on for over a quarter of a century. It's pretty amazing. You got it started. It's wonderful. But this is now a chance of not just people giving something to the food bank and going to stores and donating in the bins. This is our chance to get out there and show that we understand what you've been talking about here. And we'll go out there and we'll adopt a plot, or, we will set up a green wall, or we'll begin as an organization to be able to grow and we're part of our property, whatever. If we want a role to play in this larger dynamic, that is the low-hanging fruit, pardon that pun, but that is the best thing that we could possibly do right now to help, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Putting tangible things in people's hands to participate. And as we've talked about, Glenn, to participate in multiple ways, helping those in need in London, helping reduce climate change impacts, understanding and teaching others about that, all that being connected. And this is one of the where we've evolved to as part of our London Cares Curb Hunger campaign. That, if you go back all those years, it was all just about collecting food.
Yeah.
Now we're actually we're connecting all the dots associated with food is an everyday item that we must care for.
Yeah.
We must respect food, and we must make sure that people have food. So all that gets brought in here. And you're so correct about local governments and local people being very connected. If there's one thing that came out of the pandemic that was very useful, would be how more connected we've become through online. I can very quickly get an audience with my municipal colleagues in other cities to find out what have they done in the last little bit that we should be mimicking here in London. You don't have to necessarily research it. You just have to get on with it by having proven success elsewhere. That is all advanced so quickly in the last couple of years that we're more connected that way. So I'd like to think solutions are going to come quicker and quicker over the next handful of years because we're more connected.
That's heartening. And I think, even in this food drive, it started yesterday, it goes until the 17th, right? But you've actually made a distinction this year, which I find is interesting. It took me a bit of time to understand it, but there's a food drive and then there's a food campaign. You see the food drive ending on the 17th, but the campaign you see is going right through the summer, maybe even up until Thanksgiving, where we draw emphasis to these larger sustainable urban agriculture efforts to do it, correct? That's what you're hoping to see.
Oh, exactly. You go to all this effort, you bring partners together, and then you realize, why would you stop the inertia of what is a positive thing? So it's like there's multiple missions. We have June 7th to 17th, as you said, a traditional food drive.
Yeah.
Food's important, put on the shelves of the food bank for the summer months. But the growing season, as we know, in the harvest season goes right through. And so if you're thinking about food, and that's what we're thinking about in urban agriculture, we have a long season to work with one another. And if something doesn't fit into your schedule right now, there's an opportunity for it in July, August, September to get involved.
Yeah.
So Glenn, that's the key part. And then our good friends at Business Cares, then they ramp up and you have your Thanksgiving food drive. So you have all those pieces. The conversation does not just occur for a couple week period. It needs to be an ongoing conversation. And I go back to the weather. We talk about that all the time. We need to be talking about these other pieces all the time. And I think that's how we win this, is we get more people building it into their daily lives, sustainability, and you know what, just respecting the environment that much more. And I think we're going to move quickly on this file.
We'll talk more on this, Jay, but it's just, I think parts of this are really exciting. Thank you to you and the team for the leadership that you're showing in the community. I know you're kind of mandated to do it by City Council. On the other hand, you take it willingly and you're showing a way forward. Thank your team for us. And we'll talk again. We'll talk about these measurements and see how we're doing. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Glenn.
Thanks.